Before we gavel the hearing in, I would just like to remind audience members that disruption of committee proceedings is against the law and will not be tolerated. Although wearing themed shirts while seated in the hearing room is certainly permissible, holding up signs during the proceedings, that is not permissible. So any disruptions will result in a suspension of the proceedings until the Capitol Police can restore order. With that, I'd like to call us to order here for our hearing this morning, and ask all the members to take their seats if you could. On September the 3rd, North Korea detonated a nuclear device that, according to news reports, was stronger than all of the previous tests combined. This hydrogen bomb represents the latest advancement in North Korea's long-running nuclear and intercontinental ballistic missile programs, which now pose an urgent threat to the United States. Moreover, the apparent speed in which these North Korean advancements have occurred are challenging the security structure across East Asia, creating dangerous instability in the region, and that instability will likely be dealing with for decades to come. So today this committee is going to discuss the tools that must be deployed and fully utilized to address these threats. And I believe the response from the United States and our allies should be supercharged. We need to use every ounce of leverage. When I had breakfast this morning with Secretary Tillerson, we laid out these issues. That leverage includes sanctions. It includes diplomacy. It includes projecting information into North Korea to put maximum pressure on this rogue regime. Time is running out. And let's be clear, sanctions can still have an important impact. North Korea's advanced weapons programs rely on foreign-sourced technology. Much of these programs are made outside the country. North Korea pays an inordinate amount of money, and it has to have hard currency to do it, to run this very expensive ICBM program and this nuclear weapons program. Since it requires hard currency, that is the Achilles heel. Unfortunately, years have been wasted as sanctions have been weak, allowing North Korea to access financial resources and build its nuclear and missile programs. Any sanction that crimps North Korea's access to technology is urgently needed. Congress has done its part to ramp up economic pressure. We passed a North Korea Sanctions Act last February, authored by myself and Mr. Elliot Engel, our ranking member. In July, we increased the tools at the administration's disposal as part of the big sanctions package that we passed here, including sanctions on North Korea and Russia and the Iran missile program. Part of that included targeting North Korean slave labor exports. Part of it, again, refined some of the focus on banking, and part of it also was focused on exports to ports around the world from North Korea. In August, the administration secured a major victory with the unanimous adoption of UN Security Council Resolution 2371, which Ambassador Haley called the strongest sanctions ever imposed in response to a ballistic missile test. She is now hard at work on another resolution. To be effective, these tools need to be implemented aggressively. The administration deserves credit for increasing the pace of designations, and I appreciate Treasury Secretary Mnuchin's statements that more are coming. But we need to dramatically ramp up the number of North Korea-related designations. These designations do not require Beijing's cooperation. We can designate Chinese banks and companies unilaterally, giving them a choice between doing business with North Korea or the United States. And I would just observe that not doing business with the United States for many of these companies would risk bankruptcy for these institutions. Earlier this year, Treasury sanctioned the Bank of Dandong, a regional Chinese bank. And that's a good start. But we must target major Chinese banks doing business with North Korea, such as China Merchants Bank, and even big state-owned banks like the Agricultural Bank of China. They have a significant presence in the United States. And if they do not stop doing business with North Korea, they should be sanctioned now. It's not just China. We should go after banks and companies in any countries that do business with North Korea the same way. Just as we press China to enforce UN sanctions banning imports of North Korea coal and iron and seafood, we should press countries to end all trade with North Korea. This grave nuclear risk demands it. Sanctions are not the only way to apply pressure on the regime. We must maintain a united front with our allies. I just returned from South Korea, where people are on edge. We were there when the missile was launched over Japan. It doesn't matter if you're talking to government officials there or the business community or the average person on the street, they all understand the threat. So I'm pleased that the THAAD missile defense system has been fully deployed. I'm also pleased that the administration is strengthening regional deterrence through additional U.S. arms sales to Japan and South Korea, which we discussed this morning. Finally, we need to do much better at getting information into North Korea so that North Koreans can better understand the brutality and corruption of the self-serving Kim regime. And these efforts are already pressuring the regime, creating some unrest, increasing defections from North Korea, but I'm afraid here our efforts grade poorly. International broadcasting and fomenting dissent just have not been a priority, and that's unacceptable in this situation. While we should take a diplomatic approach to North Korea, the reality is that this regime will never be at peace with its people, its neighbors, or us. And now is the time to apply that pressure. With that said, let me turn to the ranking member of our committee, Mr. Elliot Engel of New York.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for calling this hearing. You and I have worked together for a long time on the Korean situation. We had a hearing on this topic to start the year. This committee's worked in a bipartisan manner to advance some of the toughest sanctions ever on North Korea, which are now U.S. law. Yesterday, the United Nations Security Council unanimously agreed to Resolution 2375 in response to the Kim regime's sixth nuclear test, and we're revisiting the threat of North Korea today so we can hear directly from the administration. Mr. Chairman, I'm grateful for your unwavering leadership on this issue. To our witnesses, welcome to the Foreign Affairs Committee, and thank you for your service. Acting Assistant Secretary Thornton, I have tremendous confidence in you and our other Korea diplomats, but it's hard to believe that nearly 8 months into this administration, there is no nominee for Assistant Secretary for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. The same goes for our Ambassador to South Korea, Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security, and a range of other senior State Department officials. This administration has said that North Korea is its top foreign policy priority. But between the President's dangerous and irresponsible communication on the matter and the inexplicable reluctance to get personnel in place, he is, in my opinion, undercutting his own peaceful pressure strategy. I view the Kim regime's nuclear program as the single greatest threat to American national security and to global security. Right now, we need all hands on deck and focused on the same objective. We do that here in this committee. But that objective, of course, also gets to one of the main questions. While we all share the desire to rid North Korea of nuclear weapons, some have said that Kim will never give them up, regardless of the pressure. I've been to North Korea twice, Mr. Chairman, as you know, and I can tell you and everybody else that this is not a regime that looks at the world the way any other government does. The Kim regime is bent on self-preservation above all else and is very willing to sacrifice their own people to achieve that end. That makes them obviously incredibly dangerous. The military options in a North Korea contingency are incredibly grim, and it's hard to overstate just how devastating a conflict on the Korean Peninsula would be. If this conflict escalates into a war, we could be measuring the cost in millions of lives lost. Time is clearly running out. Once the regime in Pyongyang possesses nuclear weapons that can strike the United States, it will immediately raise questions about the validity of our security commitments to our alliance partners, Japan and South Korea. Nuclear capabilities of this kind would likely embolden the North Koreans to engage in other bad behavior, such as harassment of our allies and continued proliferation of nuclear technologies. Some even speculate that the Kim regime might even seek reunification of the peninsula on its own terms. So we need a smart strategy, first and all, and then deft and consistent execution of that strategy, and obviously that's no easy task. Administrations of both parties were unable to put a stop to North Korea's nuclear program. North Korea detonated its first nuclear weapon in 2006, and a few years later the Bush administration removed North Korea from the state sponsor of terrorism list as an inducement to join the six-party talks. Since Kim Jong-un assumed power, bomb and missile tests have increased in frequency, and this year, since the start of the Trump administration, we've seen an alarming increase in the frequency and significance of tests, and of course the detonation a few weeks ago of what appears to be a thermonuclear device. So where do we go from here? Personally, I agree with Secretary of Defense Mattis that we're, quote, never out of diplomatic solutions when it comes to North Korea, although I'm not sure President Trump shares that view. Frankly, I'm not sure he even knows what his views are on this. At present, however, Kim Jong-un doesn't seem to be anywhere close to sitting down for talks of any kind, much less sincere negotiations. The first order of business should be to have a moratorium on testing to halt the progress of North Korea's nuclear program. Our objective has long been a denuclearized North Korea, and we cannot lose sight of that aim. In my view, we have not exhausted economic pressure through sanctions, and we need to do all we can to keep pressure up on the Kim regime. But at the same time we increase pressure, we must also ramp up coordination with our allies. We must demonstrate that defensive military measures are at the ready, both to reassure our allies and to deter the regime from any action that could lead to deadly escalation. I'm interested in hearing from our witnesses today about how we're going to pursue those aims. Under ordinary circumstances, I would say this is a tall order. But I have to say again, the President's behavior surrounding this crisis is making the situation even more challenging. Outrageous red lines like threats of fire and fury, shaming our allies through tweets, inconsistently from one day to the next about Kim Jong-un or China or our economic partnership with South Korea, picking a fight with South Korea right at this time, loose talk about expanding America's nuclear arsenal and the proliferation of these devastating weapons. All these actions undermine the credibility of the office of the President and the credibility of the U.S. government, effectively undermining U.S. leadership and driving a wedge between Washington and our friends, creating grave uncertainty with China, whose cooperation we need, and with North Korea, whose leader is, as we know, single-minded and ruthless. Our country faces a serious national security challenge, and we need principled and visionary leadership. We need to be standing with our allies, acting with integrity, and reaffirming our commitments. The President needs to lead on the global stage, pushing China and Russia to enforce sanctions effectively and building consensus about a path forward, not waiting to see who does what next and then reacting with the first words that come to mind. So I look forward to hearing from our witnesses about what American leadership should look like in this crisis and how we find the right path forward. I thank you again, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you. This morning we're pleased to be joined by a distinguished panel. We have with us Ms. Susan Thornton, Acting Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of East Asian Affairs at the Department of State. And as a career member of the Foreign Service, she has spent the last 20 years working on U.S. policy in Europe and Asia, focused on the countries of the former Soviet Union and on East Asia. Assistant Secretary Marshall Billingsley is the Assistant Secretary in the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence at the Department of the Treasury. Mr. Billingsley previously served as Managing Director of Business Intelligence Services for Deloitte, where he focused on illicit finance. And so we welcome both our witnesses to the committee. Without objection, the witnesses' full prepared statements are going to be made part of the record, and all members here are going to have 5 calendar days to submit any statements or any additional questions of you or any extraneous material for the record. And with that, I would just suggest, and we'll begin with you, Assistant Secretary Thornton, if you could summarize your remarks, and then we'll go to Mr. Billingsley, and then we'll go to questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, members of the committee, thank you so much for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the ever-increasing challenge that North Korea poses. The threat posed by North Korea's ballistic missile and nuclear program is grave. North Korea's 6th nuclear test on September 3rd is an unacceptable provocation that ignores repeated calls from the international community for a change in their behavior. It followed the August 28th ballistic missile launch that overflew portions of Hokkaido, Japan, and 2 ICBM launches in July. These provocations represent a tangible threat to the security of Japan and South Korea, our allies, and to the entire globe. We cannot allow such flagrant violations of international law to continue. North Korea has also made dramatic threats regarding its ability to hit Guam and other parts of the United States. Secretary of Defense Mattis has made clear that we have the ability to defend ourselves and our allies from any attack, and that our commitments to our allies remain ironclad. This administration, though, has developed a clear strategy of applying international pressure to hold Pyongyang to account. First, we continue to push for strong UN sanctions. Last night, the UN Security Council passed another significant set of international sanctions, the 2nd set of sanctions in the last 2 months, unanimously adopted by the UN Security Council. Second, we're using our domestic laws to impose sanctions on individuals and entities that enable the DPRK's illicit activities. Third, we are pressing countries to fully implement the UN Security Council resolutions and sanctions, and to harmonize their domestic sanctions regimes with those Security Council designations. Fourth, we're urging the international community to cease normal political interactions with the DPRK and increase its diplomatic isolation. And fifth, we're calling on countries to cut trade ties with Pyongyang to choke off revenue sources that finance the regime's weapons programs. Even as we pursue denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula, deterrence, as was mentioned by the ranking member, is a central part of our strategy. We have deployed the THAAD anti-missile system to the Republic of Korea and continue to take other measures to prepare ourselves to respond to any DPRK attack, whether on the United States, South Korea, or Japan, with overwhelming force. We've been clear we're not seeking regime change or collapse in North Korea, and we do not seek accelerated reunification or an excuse to send troops north of the demilitarized zone. We do seek peaceful denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula and a North Korea that stops belligerent actions and is not presenting a threat to the United States or our allies. We recognize that the success of this pressure strategy will depend on cooperation from international partners, especially China. And we are clear-eyed in viewing China's growing, if uneven, support for international measures against the DPRK. China has taken some notable steps on implementing sanctions, but we would like to see them do more. We continue to engage with China and Russia to further pressure the DPRK, but if they do not act, we will use the tools at our disposal. Just last month, we rolled out new sanctions targeting Russian and Chinese individuals and entities that were doing illicit trade with North Korea. So while there is more work to be done, we do see encouraging signs of progress on increasing the pressure on the North Korean regime. Countries spanning the globe have issued strong statements against the ICBM tests and the most recent nuclear tests. We've seen countries expel sanctioned North Korean officials, prevent certain individuals from entering their jurisdictions, reduce the size of North Korean diplomatic missions in their countries, and cancel or downgrade diplomatic engagements or exchanges. Just in the recent days, we've had 2 announcements by 2 countries, Mexico and Egypt, about their efforts to downgrade relations with North Korea. Countries have halted visa issuances to North Korean laborers and are phasing out the use of these workers. South Korea, Japan, and Australia have implemented unilateral national sanctions against targeted entities and individuals, and European partners are collaborating with us on maximizing pressure on the DPRK. Unfortunately, despite all of this, we've yet to see a notable change in the DPRK's dangerous behavior or signs that it is interested in credible talks on denuclearization. We will continue to step up efforts to sanction individuals and entities, enabling the DPRK regime and its weapons programs. Following the nuclear test, we are pressing hard for a new Security Council resolution, which of course was adopted last night, and we hope that these new sectoral sanctions, including textiles, provisions on oil, provisions on shipping, et cetera, will allow us to increase our pressure. China and Russia should continue to exert their unique leverage, of course, on the DPRK, and it should be clear that we will never accept North Korea as a nuclear state. We'll continue to work within our alliances to develop additional defense measures to protect the people of the United States and also of our allies. And at the same time, we will not lose sight of the plight of the 3 remaining U.S. citizens who have been unjustly detained by North Korea, nor of the regime's egregious human rights violations. We will continue to reiterate our willingness to resolve this issue through diplomacy, and if the DPRK indicates an interest in serious engagement, we will explore that option, but with clear eyes about the DPRK's past track record of violating negotiated agreements. Thank you again for letting me testify today, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, distinguished members of this committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to update you on the measures that the Treasury Department is undertaking in concert with the Department of State and the broader administration efforts to deal with the unacceptable provocations and threats posed by North Korea. In order to constrain Kim Jong-un, the international community has unanimously enacted multiple United Nations Security Council resolutions. In fact, with each provocation by North Korea's dictator, the nations of the world have responded with steadily tightening constraints of sanctions and embargoes. Under previous administrations, the United Nations had already prohibited trade in matters such as arms, luxury goods, minerals, monuments, and the maintenance of offices and subsidiaries and bank accounts in North Korea. And while this had clearly inhibited North Korea's quest for weapons of mass destruction, it was not enough. On August 5th, our administration worked with the other permanent members of the UN Security Council to pass Resolution 2371, striking at the core of North Korea's revenue generation. That resolution, drafted by the United States, embargoes all importation of North Korean coal, iron, lead, and seafood, now requires nations to cap employment of North Korean citizens sent abroad as slave labor. Very importantly, last night, under Ambassador Haley's leadership, the United States passed with the UN Security Council Resolution 2375, which now targets North Korea's few remaining sources of revenue. Very importantly, the export of textiles. It further restricts North Korea's ability to acquire revenue from overseas slave labor, and it cuts off about 55% of the refined petroleum products that are going into North Korea. and it bans further joint ventures with that regime. These two recent resolutions are central to our efforts to mobilize the international community and to deny funds to Kim Jong-un's weapons programs. The fact, however, is that North Korea has been living under UN sanctions for over a decade, and it has nevertheless made significant strides towards its goal of building a nuclear-tipped ICBM. As is the case with any international agreement, the effectiveness of UN Security Council resolutions depends upon implementation and enforcement. Kim Jong-un has two key financial vulnerabilities, which we are targeting in the Treasury Department. First, he needs revenue to maintain and expand his WMD and ballistic missile programs. And second, he needs access to the international financial system to acquire the hard currency that Chairman Royce mentioned, to transfer funds, and to pay for goods, both licit and illicit. There are only a number of finite ways that North Korea can raise significant amounts of foreign exchange. And for many years, coal has been the center of gravity for revenue generation. By our estimates, prior to the latest UN Security Council resolutions, coal shipments brought in more than $1 billion a year to the regime. North Korea was making an additional $500 million or so from iron, lead, and seafood, and the textile ban will deny them around $800 million that they were generating in previous years. This is why these resolutions are so important. Again, effective implementation of this and all of the prior UN Security Council resolutions is essential. Consistent with this, on August 22nd, we struck at the heart of North Korea's illegal coal trade with China. Treasury designated 16 individuals and entities, including 3 Chinese companies that are among the largest importers of North Korean coal. We estimate that collectively these companies were responsible for importing nearly $500 million worth of North Korean coal between 2013 and 2016. In doing this, we sent 2 clear messages. The first was to North Korea. We intend to deny the regime its last remaining sources of revenue unless and until it reverses course and denuclearizes. The second message was to China. We are capable of tracking North Korea's trade in banned goods, such as coal, despite elaborate evasion schemes, and we will act even if the Chinese government will not. On June 1st of this year, we targeted a different type of North Korean revenue, labor. We designated 3 individuals and 6 entities involved in that set of actions. We also took actions in March. In total, under this administration, the Treasury Department is engaged in a full-court press on Kim Jong-un's revenue generation networks, and we have singled out 37 specific entities involving the most lucrative types of trade. Mr. Chairman, I want to share with you today another type of evasion scheme in which North Korea is engaged. As part of their efforts to acquire revenue, the regime employs deceptive shipping practices to conceal the true origin of goods. Pyongyang falsifies the identity of vessels to make it harder for governments to determine if ships docking in their ports are linked to North Korea. And despite this evasion, we will expose the individuals and companies that are providing insurance, maintenance, or other services to North Korean vessels. For instance, in June, we designated Dalian Global Unity, a Chinese company that apparently was transferring about 700,000 tons of freight annually between China and North Korea. I'm pleased to provide with the committee today additional exposures of these duplicitous actions. The intelligence community has provided to your committee today evidence of how vessels originate in China, they turn off their transponders as they move into North Korean waters, they dock at North Korean ports, and they onload commodities such as coal. They keep those transponders off and then they turn them back on as they round the South Korean peninsula, and they head into a Russian port. In this particular case, this vessel, MV by May 8, registered in St. Kitts and Nevis, sat in that Russian port for a period of time and then headed back out to water, ultimately docking back in China with North Korean origin coal. Sanctions evasion. The second slide, which we'll show now, is yet another example. In this particular example, you have a vessel that pulled into North Korea, kept its transponder off in violation of international maritime law, docked in Russia, offloaded the North Korean coal. Another vessel, that one was Panamanian, another vessel from Jamaica, Jamaican flag, pulled in, picked up the North Korean coal, and headed straight to China, again, to circumvent UN sanctions. Mr. Chairman, the other prong of our effort is to close in on the way North Korea seeks to access the international financial system. Because of the sanctions regimes we have in place, it is difficult for North Korean individuals and entities to do business in their true names. And so that is why they maintain representatives abroad who are engaged in all manner of obfuscation of creation of shell and front companies. In fact, I dealt with many of these entities when I served in the private sector to help conceal North Korea's overseas footprint. These individuals are crucial to the North Korean regime because they have the expertise needed to establish front companies, open bank accounts, and conduct transactions to move and launder funds. It is incumbent upon the financial services industry, both here and abroad, to stay vigilant. And I urge those who might be implicated in the establishment or shell or front companies for the DPRK, or anyone who is aware of such entities, to come forward with that information now, before they find themselves swept up in our net. We are closing in on North Korea's trade representatives. This year, we've already designated several bank and trading operatives in China, Cuba, Russia, and Vietnam. And we're closely coordinating with the Department of Justice and others to target these various North Korean networks that are transferring funds. The chairman mentioned our actions against the Bank of Dandong. We have designated that bank under Section 311 of the USA Patriot Act and found it to be of a primary money laundering concern and issued a notice of proposed rulemaking. Again, I recognize that I'm over time with the committee, and therefore I will wrap up my comments. But suffice to say that our actions, this was the first Treasury Department action in over a decade that targeted a non-North Korean bank for facilitating North Korean financial activity. It demonstrates our commitment to take action. We look forward to taking action with the Chinese where possible, and in the event that that is not possible, we will nevertheless move forward to safeguard the U.S. and international financial system. Thank you, Chairman.
Assistant Secretary Billingsley, thank you very much. Let me make a point in terms of when we've seen sanctions that were effective. In 2005, we had the sanctions on Banco Delta Asia. At that point in time, in talking to a senior defector who had worked in their missile program, he indicated that because we had cut off the hard currency, they had to shut down their ICBM program. One of the things he indicated also, or was indicated by the conversations we had with senior defectors, was that during that period of time, the ability of the regime, or the dictator as they called him, to get his hands on hard currency was blocked. And the inability of a dictator to be able to pay his generals, and this was the quote, is a very bad position for a dictator to be in. In retrospect, we therefore see two things happened during that period of time in terms of the desperation of the situation within the Kim regime. This was under his father, Kim Jong-il. We have the ability to replicate that if we have the will to do what was done in 2005. And in 2005, it was maybe a dozen banks that were being used. At that time, Treasury found that North Korea was counterfeiting $100 U.S. bills, and that gave Treasury the authority to do this until such time as the Department of State forced them to lift the asset freezes. But during that time, we had an enormous amount of pressure being brought to bear. In this particular case, and let me use your words here, but it is China that is primarily involved in the support system in terms of, I'd estimate, 90% of the hard currency that the regime needs. Now, we've managed to cut off a lot of that because it's very expensive to run an ICBM program or a nuclear weapons program. Billions and billions and billions of dollars. North Korea's money has no value. So they have to get this foreign currency into the country in order to pay for it on a month-to-month basis in terms of what they're trying to build out. You said if China wishes to avoid future measures such as those imposed on Bank of Dandong or the various companies sanctioned for illegal trade practices, then it urgently needs to take demonstrable public steps to eliminate North Korea's trade and financial access. That's the point to us here in Congress. Some of our opinion on this in terms of Congress is affected by the fact that China's biggest banks, even state-owned banks, still do business with North Korea. That's got to end completely. We cannot accept half measures on this. These transactions are what supports the regime's nuclear program. And I understand the administration is pressing Beijing to take action here. I understand that many of these banks have significant operations in the United States and that there would be consequences to our economy. However, these banks' U.S. presence is the very thing that makes our sanctions so powerful. They'd rather do business with us than North Korea in terms of how consequential that is to these institutions. So at what point do we designate these major Chinese banks for doing business with North Korea? We've done our outreach to Beijing with limited results. Shouldn't we demonstrate the seriousness with which we take the North Korean nuclear threat while further isolating that regime in North Korea, Kim Jong-un, from the financial system that he uses to build out his atomic weapons program?
Chairman, first let me say that China and Russia are to be recognized for supporting the adoption of the two most recent UN Security Council resolutions, which are significant for the clampdown that they enable us to place on Kim Jong-un's revenue. However, we've been very clear that if China wishes to avoid further measures such as that which happened to the Bank of Dandong, we urgently need to see demonstrable action. I cannot tell the committee today that we've seen sufficient evidence of China's willingness to truly shut down North Korean revenue flows, to expunge North Korean illicit actors from its banking system, or to expel the various North Korean middlemen and brokers who are continuing to establish webs of front companies. We need to see that happen.
Well, and let me just, to both our assistant secretaries, say this. Last night we saw the Security Council unanimously approve its third UN sanctions resolution this year on North Korea, and this latest measure restricts the regime's oil imports while banning textile exports and joint ventures. However, the nature of the Security Council means that this was a compromise. To ensure the regime cannot claim this compromise that came out of this as a victory, which is what they'll try to do, we've got to demonstrate the impact of these new international sanctions by making certain that this time no one's skirting those sanctions. So what steps will the Departments of State and Treasury take in the coming days to implement the new Security Council resolution, and how will these actions that you're about to take send this clear message to Kim Jong-un on the reality that this time we are going to follow through with enforcement and give them no space in terms of additional hard currency?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's very clear in the process of ramping up this peaceful pressure campaign on the North Korean regime that one of the key elements is to keep the global coalition that we've got behind these sanctions together, and to keep every single country in the coalition working actively to continue to squeeze on trade, on laborers, on financial transactions, on shipping, et cetera. And what we've been doing in the Department of State is working across the board with every one of our diplomatic partners around the world. The Secretary raises the North Korea issue in every single one of his meetings with foreign leaders. And we have seen a great response from countries around the world who are increasingly outraged over North Korea's provocative behavior. So we have really been working hard to close the net. We've seen, diplomatic establishments closed, ambassadors kicked out, other North Korean representatives kicked out. All kinds of, the Philippines announced recently they're going to cut completely trade with North Korea. So we are having an effect on a lot of the networks that the North Koreans have built around the world. I think the sanctions 2371 last month and now 2375 last night, we are going to be working aggressively to make sure that we and all of our partners around the world too are working with every country that we can to make sure that every country has the capacity to track illicit transactions, to go after violators, and raising consciousness, but both also giving them the tools to go after those bad actors is what we're focused on. We're trying to clean up ship registries and give countries the ability to do track better the shipping of ships that are flagged under their flag, et cetera. So I think we're still working on implementing these most recent 2 UN Security Council resolutions. We also have an ongoing, very close dialogue with the Chinese on what they're doing to track sanctions, and we share a lot of information with them, but we will also drive them to shut down networks that we find.
Thank you, Assistant Secretary Thornton. My time's expired. I'm going to go to Mr. Engel for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, when I was in North Korea, and this is a while back, but twice, one of the things struck me. We had just deposed Saddam Hussein, and one of the top North Korean officials, it wasn't the leader, but it was very high-ranking official, said to us, Saddam Hussein didn't have nuclear weapons, and look where he is now. From those 2 trips I took, that's the one thing that rang in my ears. And now, of course, they're carrying out those horrific words. Let me, Secretary Thornton, let me ask you. In Europe, we have NATO, obviously. In Asia, we don't have a treaty group like NATO. So how do we reassure, in your view, our allies who doubt our resolve to defend Tokyo or Seoul because we're afraid of what might happen in Los Angeles or Guam or any other place? How do we reassure them, our allies?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. I think we have been working very, very closely with both South Korea and Japan, but also with all the other countries in the Asia-Pacific region on confronting the North Korea challenge. We work, obviously, we have a very close and continuing conversation with both Japan and Korea, not just the State Department, but the Department of Defense on managing our alliances. Obviously, we've been talking to both Japan and Korea, as the chairman mentioned, about additional defensive needs and capabilities that they may have that they want to move ahead on. And so I think the reassurance that we've been providing them with and the constant close communication with them and with others in the region has been of significant reassurance to them about our ongoing commitment to the defense of our allies.
Thank you very much. Secretary Billingsley, can the U.S. And could you identify the top, say, 25 firms that compose North Korea's illicit network, and if so, would you be willing to provide that information to this committee in classified form if necessary?
Ranking Member, yes, we would be pleased to have a classified discussion with you on a number of North Korean entities that we are actively targeting. However, once we choose to move with designations and blocking of assets and so forth, we would want to keep that kind of information very close hold until we're ready to move so that the money doesn't flee in advance of our actions.
Okay, I think there would be interest in this committee for such a gathering, so we'll be in touch with you. We'll do it together, the chairman and I. Let me ask you about these entities. If Beijing and the other relevant governments haven't taken sufficient action to close these entities and curb their activities, have we taken action to designate these entities under U.S. law?
Yes, sir, we have. We've done a couple of waves of that under this administration. Our August 22nd actions that I referenced were probably the most noteworthy and are definitely a signal of things to come.
Have we informed Beijing? These entities operate, it's my understanding these entities operate in China and a small number other jurisdictions. Have we informed Beijing of the activities of these entities and communicated the expectation of the U.S. government that their actions be curbed?
Yes, sir. Both the Department of the Treasury and the Department of State are in repeated communications with our counterparts in China, often very specifically with respect to entities that we believe are associated with the North Korean regime, and we make very specific requests for action on these entities.
Thank you. Look, this is a problem that goes back to a number of administrations before this one. But the president didn't inherit a complex and intractable foreign policy problem in North Korea, but his mixed and inconsistent messaging is self-inflicted. It's a self-inflicted wound. Again, I don't see the purpose of arguing with South Korea on trade at a time when we need to show strong and resolve. So let me ask you this. I have so many questions to ask, I can never get them in a short period of time. But let me go back to you, Secretary Billingsley. The chairman mentioned several large Chinese banks in his remarks. China Merchants Bank was one of them. Have we taken action against them? And if we haven't, why haven't we?
So, Congressman, we have taken action against Bank of Dandong, as was discussed earlier,
right,
which we believe is a money laundering concern associated with North Korea. And our actions have had a very clear effect on that bank's operations. That is a signal of our intent to move forward with expunging from the international financial system any financial institution which is taking insufficient action from an anti-money laundering standpoint against North Korea. We believe that the next most important thing to do here is to very specifically target and expose those individuals who are the financial facilitators for the North Korean regime, who set up these elaborate front and shell company structures, which are then used to get the bank accounts to launder the money. And that is a priority focus area for us, and we are driving very, very quickly forward on that matter.
Thank you. Secretary Thornton, did you want to add something to it?
Yeah, I just wanted to note for the committee that the Chinese have announced in the last couple of days measures against all of their big banks operating, particularly in Northeast China, issuing warnings and prohibitions about opening accounts for North Korean actors. So they are actually feeling some pressure on this and making public statements.
One quick thing. You both would agree that any kind of resolution or partial resolution of this crisis has to go through China, that it's virtually impossible to not involve China. China, I think we all think, is the one country that can influence North Korean behavior. Do you both of you agree with that?
I do.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Engel. We go now to Mr. Chris Smith of New Jersey, whose subcommittee leads our work on human rights.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for your leadership and for putting together this important hearing. And I do want to thank our distinguished witnesses for painstakingly working the details of this. It's an extremely difficult fight, and I want to thank you for what you're doing every day to make a difference. I also want to express my deepest respect to Ambassador Haley and the administration for drafting UN Resolution 2375, as you have pointed out, the toughest sanctions ever meted out against North Korea. My hope is that China and Russia will comply with the terms and conditions, and you might want to speak to your expectations about that, because obviously in the past it's been lackluster in many ways. I would also appreciate your thoughts on how you judge the success or failure of strategic patience, and whether or not you thought that aided and got us to where we're at now, or was this inevitable anyway? For many, there is a significant, and I think a profoundly significant, underappreciation for Juche the dictatorship cult deification of Kim Il-sung. I've read books about it. I've talked to many of the diaspora and refugees who speak and they say, you Americans don't get it. The worship of Kim Il-sung is so profound, so deeply embedded, and it does lead to a fanaticism that rivals ISIS-like fanaticism about what they would do for their leader, the great leader going back and now to the current leader. And I think if we underappreciate that, do you think an information surge, there's nothing that precludes us from broadcasting despite jamming capabilities that they might have, even more to demystify the Kims, because the big lie has certainly been embedded in the hearts and minds of so many North Koreans for so long. Every time I talk to a group of defectors and I ask them that question, they wax eloquent about how from the youngest age right up and those expressions when one of the leaders die and the tears and people throwing themselves on the ground, it's not fake. It's fanaticism. And when it comes to the military, that means that fanaticism will be carried out with horrific consequences for those that are defending liberty in South Korea and elsewhere. And finally, we know that China subsidizes North Korea's bad behavior. It enables torture of asylum seekers by repatriating those who escape to China in direct contravention of the Refugee Convention, and provides Kim Jong-un needed currency by employing thousands of trafficked workers. And I'm wondering if the department is looking at, with regards to China, imposing Magnitsky-like, global Magnitsky sanctions against those who are complicit in those crimes. Even the UN Commission on Inquiry for North Korea recommended that sanctions be used to target individuals. We've got the law, and I hope that's something that is under active consideration, and hopefully we'll hear soon about individuals being so targeted. Ms. Thornton.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think, of course, the U.S. State Department has been very concerned about the egregious human rights situation in North Korea for decades. We've had a special representative working on these issues. We've worked very closely with him. I think we've made some good progress, or at least we've taken a number of very significant actions in this area, and will continue to do so. I think the question of increasing information access inside North Korea is one that we certainly have looked at and are working on, and whether we can do more there. I think we're always looking at whether we can do more and what we can do more effectively. But I think from my standpoint, one of the biggest ways we can get people inside North Korea to question what the regime is doing is by making it very difficult for them to pay the military and to provide for their citizens. And I think that's really what we're very focused on, in addition to trying to knock down the proliferation networks that are contributing to the weapons program. So, I mean, there's a litany of egregious behavior across the board, and we want to go after every single aspect of that. But I think, looking at cutting off the economic flows to North Korea is another way of
and of course, that would include the complicity of Tehran, Iran, with the ballistic missile program in North Korea.
Sorry, I didn't get the connection.
the cooperation between the Iranians and Pyongyang when it comes to ballistic missiles, is that something? It's something that I and others asked questions at when the Iran deal was being contemplated, and unfortunately that was left off the table in the final agreement. But the concern is that cooperation continues today, and I hope that that's something that's very aggressively being pursued as well.
Yeah, we're certainly looking at that.
Yes, sir.
But you didn't want to speak to Joe Che, or we're just
well, let me.
Please.
Let me. So first of all, Congressman, I had your leadership on human rights matters has been for quite a long time. I had a chance to work for you when I was a staffer on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee back in the 1990s under Chairman Helms in those days. And again, appreciate the stand that you take on these matters. We are very specifically looking at a number of individuals in North Korea who are engaged in egregious, outrageous human rights abuses. This matter of Juche, I think you've articulated it exactly correctly. However, I'm not sure that the cult of personality necessarily extends to all of the elites right around the dear leader. He very much, I think, depends upon this hard currency revenue, as the chairman has noted, to maintain his opulent lifestyle and that of the people around him. And so the extent to which draining his ability to generate hard currency not only constricts his ability to engage in WMD and missile programs, but it also presumably increases the fragility of the regime around him. This is, as we would say, a twofer in our view.
Mr. Brad Sherman of California.
Soon North Korea will have more nuclear weapons than they feel is absolutely necessary to defend themselves from us. But they will need hard currency. They might prefer actual cash currency. Iran is having some constraints on its ability to develop nuclear weapons. Mr. Assistant Secretary, do we have any understanding with China that nonstop flights between Pyongyang and Tehran will be forced to stop for fueling? Or do we have anything else that would prevent this obvious economic deal?
I'll defer to State Department on the specific discussions on air choreo and flights in and from North Korea. I would also, Congressman, note that as we move forward on these two successive UN
I've got very limited time.
Sure.
Do we have anything or not?
I know that we have limitations on air refueling. I know the Chinese have refused to refuel, so there is pressure on...
No, I'm not asking, but I'm saying do we have any understanding with China that there'll be non-stop, no refueling planes going from Tehran to Pyongyang, loaded with currency or coming back with a nuclear weapon?
No, we don't.
We don't. Okay. So we have one
from...
country that has over $1 billion in saran wrapped hard currency, and we have another country that, if the Assistant Secretary's work is done well, will need $1 billion in currency and will have quite a number of nuclear weapons that they could sell. Folks, I've been coming to this room for 20 years, and not much has changed. We've got Ileana smiling down upon us. That's good. We've got some electronics. But for 20 years, administrations have been coming here and telling me that we don't have to make any concessions to North Korea. We don't have to do anything that would make any single American company upset. And we're going to make the American people safe. And for 20 years, I've been hearing that over and over again. I hear that we're going to have unprecedented sanctions, which means that we found a few more companies to sanction, just as they've invented a few more companies and created them. Whether we can list them faster than they can create them, I don't know. But the fact is that North Korea's real GDP has grown 50% in the last 20 years. If Assistant Secretary, if you were successful with your sanctions, you might just cause them not to increase their GDP, which means they still have 50% more than they found necessary to hold on to power back in 1997. But while we haven't made the American people safer, we've met the political objectives here in the United States. We don't threaten China even a little bit with country sanctions, because that would be politically difficult for the United States to do. We don't adopt reasonable objectives like a freeze in the North Korean program, because that would be politically difficult to do. What we do is what we've been doing for 20 years. We've heard, and Chairman Royce has always come up with this or that better sanction. Sometimes his ideas are listened to, sometimes they're not. But there's never enough pressure on the North Korean regime to cause regime-threatening levels. This is a regime that survived the famines in the 1990s, late 1990s. Now their GDP is 50% higher than it has been. It's going up just about every year. And China is not going to allow us to put regime-threatening pressure on the North Korean regime. They may punish them a little bit for what they're doing and how they're doing it and how disruptive they are and how headline-grabbing they are. But, Mr. Assistant Secretary, do we even have a plan for threatening China with country sanctions, tariffs on all goods? Or is it just a matter that, well, your number 7 bank won't be able to do business in the United States, so your number 8 bank and your number 1 through 5 banks will? If you were running a retailer, would you think there was the slightest risk of your supply chain to China because of China's unwillingness to engage in the kinds of sanctions necessary just to get a freeze of the nuclear program?
Congressman, I think you raise a good point, and the chairman noted that China is central to this matter. 90% of North
and we are not doing enough to force them to change their behavior, which is to punish North Korea a little bit for being a little bit too flamboyant in their actions, but to make sure that the regime can survive. And this regime won't even agree to a freeze of their nuclear program unless you have something relatively at least halfway toward regimes threatening sanctions.
Yeah, I'm not sure I agree with that. We are.
You think the regime would give up its nuclear program even if they said, well, we can survive these sanctions, but we care so much about our people that we care about our GDP, we might lose the next.
I wouldn't speculate on regime thought processes. What I would focus on is the Chinese as the center of gravity here. And I think that, in fact, I know that from a tempo standpoint and from a pressure standpoint, the pace of action that we have taken, even on my...
It's unprecedented, just like the last 19 years people have sat in that chair and told me it's unprecedented. But it's certainly not been enough to stop.
Will the gentleman yield?
I will yield.
I think the gentleman is raising exactly the bottom line question here. In other words, we're deferential here to a point, but it's been a long time since the 94 Framework Agreement with North Korea. It's been a long, long time of waiting for China to comply with the sanctions we pass and, frankly, with the sanctions that the United Nations pass. As you've just laid out for us with the charts that you've provided, China understands that coal is coming, circumventing the sanctions and being unloaded, just as they understand that these banks are not complying with the provisions that have been passed by the Security Council. I think that Mr. Sherman raises a point. I have only seen once in 2005 in response, as I said, to North Korea counterfeiting our currency, and that power was soon taken away from the Treasury, that I ever saw anything that cut off hard currency into the regime, and that was because we didn't give anyone an option anywhere. If you were doing business, we were shutting down those institutions. So I would just say this is where the discussion needs to go next if there isn't full compliance with the sanctions that the UN have passed, because what's at risk is our national security. And there's only one way to shut a program down with a country like North Korea that doesn't have its own revenues. And I thank the gentleman from California for raising the point. I yield back to him.
I'll just say that for 20 years we've talked about company sanctions instead of country sanctions. For 20 years, China has carried out a policy where they smile at us, but they've done enough with North Korea so that their GDP is 50% higher in real terms. That's much better economic growth than we've achieved. So the sanctions have not prevented a high level of economic growth. And my guess is that we will continue the policies that we have in the past, perhaps at a louder volume. I would finally point out that in terms of, we've got to also remember how small the North Korean economy is, how difficult it is to squeeze. Yes, we're trying to go after their oil, but they use about the same amount of oil as 150 gas stations total, whole country. That's less than there are on Ventura Boulevard. it's going to be very, and of course they can liquefy their coal and use that in lieu of oil. So it's going to be tough to put this regime under enough pressure to even get a freeze. And the idea that we would ever get this regime, and having seen Saddam, having seen Gaddafi, to actually give up its nuclear weapons, I yield back.
We go to Mr. Dana Rohrabacher of California, chairman of the